So just the same way as you can never watch every movie in one lifetime, you can never taste every wine in one lifetime. Not to mention that wine has the element that every bottle is constantly changing and evolving, but it is a highly intellectual pursuit. Yes, you can watch a movie to be entertained, or you can drink a wine just to get a buzz. But what you're really looking for is that thing that's going to change you as a person. Something changes about you. Like your soul lights up for a sec when you put your nose in the glass and something about it captivates you.
Sit back and grab a glass. It's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio today, beautiful downtown Monrovia, about to have a conversation with Robert Vardanian of Wally. He's the director of wine purchasing and sales. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you.
You know, I was thinking about, what this conversation would be like, and it would certainly, have so much to talk about. But Wally's was, it was around. My dad's store in the 70s was around. It's one of the oldest, most respected wine brand stores in not only the state, but the country, is it not?
Yeah, since 1968.
Oh, they started in 68. Okay.
Yeah, it's always been a LA-based operation until we opened our Las Vegas location a few years back. But even for me, it blows my mind how many people throughout the country are aware of Wally's, all the way up to the East Coast. You just mentioned the name, and they're like, oh, yeah, we know Wally's, so...
Well, my dad's store started at 68 as well, and it's part of that group. And if you listen to Bruce Nyers, the old codger, I didn't mean that, Bruce, but Bruce is a great friend. But if one of the old guys in the trade, right, there aren't too many from his generation around anymore, and he would say that a sales call for him at Joseph Phelps was load up the station wagon, drive to L.A., stop at Palos Verdes Wines and Spirits, my dad's shop. Stop at Wally's. Stop at the Beverly Hills Wine Merchant, and maybe the Green Jug or a couple of these other places, and go home. That was it. Hopefully the truck was empty.
Yeah.
It's kind of different now.
It's changed a lot. I wish I had seen that chapter of it.
Yeah, it was different. I was stocking the shelf, hiding in the beer case, so I don't remember. I did actually weld my father's wine racks in the wine shop, because he wanted to display Jeroboam's. And that was like my contribution to the display of the thing.
I love that. I love wine shops themselves. It's my passion. And so, I listened to your show and hearing you talk about your dad and, growing up in that environment. It's a very special concept, the wine shop. It's a beautiful thing. And I hope even as we see changes in how retail operates, I hope that's something we hold on to.
Do you think it's going back to that? Or you think there was a lull in the wine shop concept?
I think so. I think we're all feeling the convenience of online purchasing.
Yeah.
I don't think that medium translates well for wine, but we can't deny that there's always going to be large segments of people who are going to choose convenience over that personal touch, that hand recommendation. Not to mention wine is so complex, right? You find that every customer falls somewhere on their journey in that spectrum. And if you're just getting into it, or you're really just trying to figure out what you like and you're experimenting, these days you could go online and just buy a whole bunch of wines and find out at home, especially post-COVID. But those of us who are in the industry know that there's no substitute for that in-person hand recommendation, the wines having been vetted, things that you recommend that you fully stand by. So I think there'll always be a place for it for wine because it's such a complex medium. But we all know how convenient it is these days to go on Amazon and buy anything and have it delivered the next day. So we're kind of, I think, in a transition period, figuring
an
that out.
interesting thought, and I think it's changing. And so we'll get to your career later, because I want to stay on this subject for a second. When I was on Amazon, the Wine Club with prolific marketeers. We sent 33 million emails. You probably heard that on one of the podcasts. Our last year. That takes a lot of effort.
I got tired hearing messages.
Yeah, I know. I got to change some of the messaging. But the point being, when we were on Amazon and we uploaded everything, imports, domestics, whatever they would allow us, there was some restrictions. We only sold Stella Rosa.
I remember you mentioned that. Yeah.
So I thought, okay, that means the buyer, particularly an Amazon buyer anyway, is really just looking for the familiar thing and prepared to pay even a little more than they could have gotten at a Target. Like 30% more because of the convenience of it.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's not where they go hang out looking for an experience of wine. They just want to buy the regular stuff. Apothic Red, is $4.99 instead of $2.99,
right,
on Amazon. And so I think that the industry is prepared to regen itself as what wine really is about. And you said it's this complicated product. And then I watched this movie on the plane the other day, and it was the most brilliant comment. And the guy says, and this thing's set like in 1890, and there's a bunch of guys having wines, and it's a cuisine-related show. And he says, wine is the intellectual part of a meal. It just rang home to me.
Yeah.
Right?
It's what's always drawn me to it. It's the intellectual pursuit.
It's that thought process that goes into that first sip.
Yeah. And, before I got into wine, the only thing that I was really obsessed about was film. And all throughout high school, I wouldn't really pay attention in class, and I was just obsessed with films. And I'd go home and, until late at night, I'd be watching classics and studying them and studying filmmakers and auteur theory and all these interesting things. And in a lot of ways, if that makes sense to me, it's finding something where you can intellectually dive in head first, and there's no shortage of things to explore. So just the same way as you can never watch every movie in one lifetime, you can never taste every wine in one lifetime. Not to mention that wine has the element that every bottle is constantly changing and evolving, but it is a highly intellectual pursuit. And I think where you divide that line between your Amazon shopper, who in your case you said was buying Stella Rosa, versus your person who actually bothers to drive down to a wine shop and have a conversation, is to what extent does the consumer see it as an intellectual pursuit, right? And that's where wine shops have to become more specialized. And we see that, right? There's wine shops that focus on natural wine. There's wine shops like Wally's that are definitely focused more on the premium side of the spectrum. And so you're almost, finding your demographic through that. Ideally, you want to have something available for everybody so that no matter who comes through the door, they can have a great bottle to take home. But I think online is really forcing what wine shops remain to become more specialized and to really hone in on the customer service aspect. Because now when you go on a lot of these online wine shops, you get that little bubble that pops up that says, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, how may I help you?" And it just seems so unnatural for a medium like wine. Maybe useful if, you're trying to buy a printer or something like that. But for wine, you need the human touch.
What was it about the film process and the intrigue of film? Was it the creative process or the storytelling, or what was it that intrigued you so much about it?
I think two things. I think the story element, which, as you listen to your podcast, is the overarching theme, right? These are conversations about why people are drawn to wine, what they do, and their story. And I think, obviously, film is a very direct form of a story.
Hey, have a listen to Stephanie Franklin of Fly Wines. She was sitting at a cafe with a friend, sort of lamenting their corporate America life, and decided to start a wine company. And this takes a lot of risk and a lot of guts, frankly. And they are flywines.com. Check her out. Really interesting story about how she broke away from corporate America and started her own thing. As well, Rachel Martin was in a studio not too long ago. And I had the first time in my career had a chance to taste a Pinot Noir from a specific vineyard in California and its non-alcoholic counterpart from the same vineyard and the same vintage. Crazy comparison. Have a listen to that show. She's sort of a flag waver for the non-alcoholic and low-alcoholic brands.
But also any art form where there's just so many examples to explore. And, no matter the greatest film I ever saw or the worst, I always got something out of it, even if I just learned what not to do. And wine is much the same way. I almost never buy the same bottle of wine twice. If something truly blows me out of the water, I might. But generally, I'm always just trying to see what else is out there. And even in bad wines, you learn something. Mm-hmm. And this is how you hone your tastes and you understand, what's good and what's not, so that you can filter that in your buying decisions.
One of the lessons I learned from my dad, you will taste everything. Even if you put it to your nose and it's oxidized or it's matterized or there's a problem with it, you're going to taste it.
Yeah.
And he was a chemist, so my mom would complain he would come back from work smelling like, grape extract because he'd be tasting the cough syrups all the time. But his palate got refined by tasting all these chemicals as his first trade. But, we'd almost cuss at him when, in my mind, when I'd smell a wine in front of a vendor and go, I got to taste this, even though I know it's got a problem because of what you can learn from that. But I think the creative process, when you said that you were intrigued with film, and so was I. That I wanted to go to USC Film School. I was accepted to it, and I didn't take them up on it. That maybe that does apply to the wine trade. That wine is a creative artwork, and it is intellectual. Film is intellectual. Art is intellectual.
And you know what's an interesting contrast between the two? This only occurred to me a couple of years ago, and I was like, wow, that's an interesting concept. Wine is really experienced through two senses, smell and taste.
Mm-hmm.
And film is experienced through two senses, which are exclusive of those, which is sight and sound. And so they almost appeal to something very human just through different sense organs and how you perceive it. So you watch a film and it's really just images, in rapid succession and light and sound, but it resonates something emotional. And for people who don't drink wine or aren't into it or say that they prefer beer or something else, they haven't quite had that emotional connection to it. And it's really what makes the medium so interesting. Yes, you can watch a movie to be entertained, or you can drink a wine just to get a buzz. But what you're really looking for is that thing that's going to change you as a person, that film that really makes you change how you see the world or how you see people or anything. And wine's much the same way. When you find that great bottle, as I don't need to tell you, but something changes about you. Like your soul lights up for a sec when you put your nose in the glass and something about it captivates you. And even what you said about tasting flawed wines, just a few days ago, I opened a bottle of champagne at home. And champagne specifically among all the different wine types is the one that just puts a smile on my face.
That's so funny. I'm the same way.
Yeah, I think everyone in the industry is crazy about champagne. And this particular bottle, is a long work day and, put my boy to sleep. And it was just me and my wife. And she actually has stopped enjoying sparkling wine, but it's not a problem for me because I get the whole bottle. Yeah. I put my nose in the glass and it was corked, which is very uncommon for champagne. Yeah. I think I've only ever encountered that 3 times in my whole career. And it was disappointing because I was looking forward to it, but I smelled it and I said, despite the cork taint, this is an incredible wine. I didn't drink it because I knew I wasn't getting the full picture of what it needed to be, but I took it to the wine shop that I bought it from and I swapped it out. And sure enough, the wine was miraculous. So even the quality of the wine shined through the cork taint.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think I agree with your dad. You got to taste it all.
You got to taste it all. Believe me, stand there Tuesdays for 35 years, you taste all that stuff. In fact, I was telling somebody at Guinea Fest, and for the listeners, Guinea Fest was the Armenian wine show that was recent. But I was telling somebody the post of that show that when I saw who was coming in on Tuesday on the calendar, I had a pretty reasonable expectation of what percentage of the wines I thought would be acceptable for the club. And there were vendors at the show where I knew that 90% of them would be flawed, a problem. And the comment I made to them was that one table, cork to bottle or cork and bottle, I thought was particularly for a new guy trying to break into this industry, and it's a supplier, which is even tougher when the margins are worse, and did a really good job of curating a pretty good book. Now I would a different store to go out and sell them, but I thought that there was a solid book. But we'll get at that in a second. I want to stay on this emotional effect of wine because it's an important feature of what we do and why we do it. And I'm wondering if that emotional connection is why, as a beverage, it's 6,000 years old, at least, maybe 12, and it probably isn't a whole lot different technologically. Now, how we make it's different than how the metrics we have to gauge manufacturing wine, but really it's still fermented, pressed grape juice as it was. Maybe it's that emotional connection, that intellectual thought process that hits your head. You're not sure what it is when you smell that glass of wine that it finally brings you to the table, but that can never go away. That can never be innovated out of the product. That can never be handled by putting it in a can or changed because you put it in a can or a pouch or whatever these people are doing.
Yeah, I think the miracle of wine has never gone away. Yeah. And that miracle is the fact that the terroir, the land, does matter. And even to this day, with all of our advancements in and understanding in winemaking sciences and practices, I think the overall quality of all wines is higher than it's ever been, and that will continue. But it still shines true that the greatest vineyards over the centuries have remained the greatest vineyards, potentially changing now because of global warming, but it still proves that wine is not something that you can get down to a chemical science and bottle the exact same way, the way you can other food products or beer or other things that could follow a recipe and that you could test to make sure it has the same properties each time. Bottle variation, evolution in the bottle, all of these things just add to the mystery and the intrigue. And I think if ever the day comes where we do lock in a recipe and can, mass produce Montrachet on a grand scale, I think wine dies there.
Yeah, it does.
But I don't think that day will come.
Well, I don't know if you've heard the podcast with May Song, the woman who was in their chateau and the Nazis came, their parents' chateau.
I did listen to that one.
And I'm thinking, yeah, that is what's in the bottle. Because it is terroir driven, and of course we understand picking conditions and all the stuff that goes on, and global warming is changing some of this. But don't you agree that the stories handed down from generations, or even people that aren't related to the winery owner, like the Bezjins are now dabbling, they don't have generations to rely on, but that story ends up in the bottle, not in a piece of tannic acid or fruit character, but the philosophy of what wine is and what that bottle will be ends up in the bottle.
There's a great analogy I like, or not an analogy, but something that reminds me of wine is in Saving Private Ryan. In one of the early scenes after the initial battle, Tom Sizemore's character, he grabs a handful of dirt and he puts it in a canister and he closes it and it's labeled France. And then he puts it in his bag. And while he's putting it in there, you see that there's other canisters that say Germany or Belgium or whatever they say. And it's that idea of, at the end of the day, he's putting dirt in a can.
Yeah.
That's not the beauty of wine, but it's the story of what that represents, where you've been, the story of that land in a container that you can now take back home, that you can transport. And that's really what wine is. It's the story of a particular place and a particular time and the people that made it, bottled, and then that experience can be sent out throughout the world and it could be enjoyed immediately or 30 years from now or 100 years from now. It's a really magical product and medium. It's an art form.
At Wally's, the clientele, it's Beverly Hills, in the heart of Beverly Hills, actually. There's this issue in the wine trade now about the generational gaps. And even with the election, you find that the generations are having an impact on the way, the politics goes. And certainly the wine trade is reeling from different generations that have grown up in different environments that are now drinking different things. But my romantic view, you've probably heard this on the podcast, is that eventually they'll all come to the table for that premium glass of wine and why it still is a premium glass of wine. Have you seen this, or what is the experience on the floor at Wally's?
Well, the Wally's consumer is pretty much a built-in clientele, right? As you referenced Beverly Hills location, all the locations have a slightly different clientele, but they all come to Wally's for the same experience. I think for a long time coming, people will come to that location and they will expect us to have all the first growths, and they'll expect us to have DRC and Petrus and all these things. Doesn't always mean that that's what's being ordered. We have 100 wines by the glass, and
wow,
one of the only ways you keep a program like that going is if it's being shopped on an even level. So, while we don't have any shortage of big price tag bottles going out to the table, you also sell lots of glasses of affordable wines. And so one of the great things about Wally's is it's kind of become that mecca of keeping that wine culture alive, right? Because whether you just want a glass of rosé because it's refreshing and you're having a light lunch, or that we're going to have great vintages of first growth Bordeaux and you have that with a steak at dinner, I think it draws the wine lover. Because there's a lot of great restaurants in Beverly Hills, right? And you can have a great meal at any number of them. But something about the Wally's experience is unique in the way that it incorporates that retail. And that's what I was always drawn to with the company. When I first applied for the job, Beverly Hills had just opened. It had only been open for a month. And I walked in and I don't think I quite realized the extent to which restaurant and retail were interwoven. And as a wine professional, you often have to choose between one or the other. Am I going to work in restaurants or am I going to work in retail? Or are you going to work in distribution?
Sure, hospitality is different.
Yeah, but the ability to do both and the ability to recommend a glass of wine and get the guest's immediate reaction and then to send them home with a bottle of that or a bottle of something else or a gift, it's fun. It's great to be able to offer both sides of that experience. As far as the changes, I think they're undeniable. I think we're going to see some, ebbs and flows in wine sales and trends and consumption. I think for us being a bit more specialized in fine wine and classic wine, there's always going to be people who are going to appreciate that. If you relate it to other industries and other luxury goods, whether it's watches or cars, those industries too go through their ups and downs of sales, but there will always be a client for something that's well made, that's delivered with great service. And then you add the food element to it. It's kind of the full package.
What did you bring to the table for Wally's when you showed up a month before it opened or a month after?
They were looking for sommeliers because, as we mentioned, Wally's had been around since 1968. But when Beverly Hills opened, it was the first restaurant concept.
Mm-hmm.
It was the flagship. And so we needed a team of sommeliers. And I'd only had one sommelier job before that at Boa Steak, also in Los Angeles. And I knew Wally's, I knew the reputation. And as I mentioned earlier, I've always loved wine shops. So I wanted to be in that environment. I have a very romantic notion of wine merchants. And so when I saw it was both, I said to myself, I have to work here. This is the place for me. And so for the first 4 years I was with the company, we called it retail sommelier, is because you were a sommelier who recommended wines like in any other restaurant, but you also had the retail element to it. So you could pick up a phone call from your client and send a case of wine his way.
Mm-hmm.
You could, gift wrap a high-end bottle of tequila and have it ready for pickup if somebody wanted to give something to their boss or their husband or whatever it might be. So that's really what got me through the door, and I just loved it. So I didn't really feel compelled to ever see what else was out there.
Boa is that sort of contemporary steakhouse, right?
Yeah, they have 2 locations. I worked at the West Hollywood one.
Yeah.
I had basically
there all the time.
Lots of celebrities. It's a beautiful restaurant, and it's definitely a Los Angeles institution, especially that location.
Do you think hospitality is dead? The hospitality, let me put it a different way. We went to Doha on Qatar Air, and I told Sandra, my wife, I said, if I was a younger person, because everybody says that, and I needed to learn hospitality, I would go there and suffer through the conditions, whatever there. I get sort of almost in servitude to work there in that part of the world. But the level of quality hospitality is every single person that works at this place has been trained properly. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean. Is that dead? Is that type of training? Is that type of person post-COVID still exist?
I think it's the goal to strive towards. I think there is a desire for slightly more casual service. I think that's happening. Not everybody, the last...
From the consumer side.
Yeah. The first few times I ate at a 3 Michelin star restaurant, I was absolutely blown away by the service, the execution, the food, the timing, the orchestra that is the service staff. The last 2 times I ate at 3 Michelin star restaurants, I vowed not to go back. I said, I'm capping it at 1, maybe 2 Michelin.
Yeah, right.
But this is, transformed into something so abstract that the pleasure has been sucked out of it.
That's kind of an interesting thought.
Yeah. So, at Wally's, the goal has always been that the quality of the product is second to none. The wines, the food. The service, though, while professional, needs to be warm. It can't be too stiff. It can't be too synchronized to the point where it's mathematical. And so what happens is you end up with different servers, different bartenders, different sommeliers, all of whom have different personalities, all of whom bring something different to the table. And inevitably, guests connect with certain people and they become regulars. That's the model for Wally's. I think the level of service that's done at the really high end is not as popular as it used to be because, again, it feels a little detached. But that doesn't go to say that drinks need to arrive at a certain time. Food needs to arrive at a certain time, at a certain temperature. Service should be effortless, but the warmth of the hospitality needs to be there. And I think right now we're in a period where post-COVID, everything is a little more casual. Everything's a little more relaxed. You see that in different restaurants you go to. For a long time, it was an issue just getting service staff in all restaurants throughout the country.
Has that eased a little bit?
It's eased, definitely. And I see that just from the sheer number of people who are now interested in applying for position.
Yeah.
That was a struggle for a couple of years because, people post-COVID didn't go back to restaurant jobs. There was a lot of things that changed after that.
Yeah, it seemed like the trained hospitality worker, whether it was wine or food, post-COVID, like, wow, that was hard work. I didn't realize how hard I was working because it was you go on autopilot and you just do it because of the passion, like in The Bear, that whole series.
Yeah.
And then now it's also, though, I think, an indelible part of society to have that service and go to a place where you feel like you're comfortable and you understand the waiter and the waitress and he or she is taking care of you and you go there because of that. I mean, that is the reason. I don't know if you ever read Patrick Hughes' The Last Days of Haute Cuisine in America. He's the GM down at one of the GMs down at the Arthur J in Manhattan. But it's a story about Le Pavillon in New York, and that type of service level. The Kennedys would go there, and it's really intriguing stuff because I think Cuisine in America finally now is getting recognized throughout the world, and it took the guys of the 80s, the Jonathan Waxmans of the world, to bring it to the table, the Alice Waters. And I just think that the humanity wants to be, in general, we want to be appreciated by the people who we support by going to their restaurants or going to their wine shop and expect a certain level of hospitality and recognition. And you're right. We were at Louis XV in Monaco during the race. And my friends were just like, come on, man. He goes, when's this going to end? It was like 12 courses. We were stuffed, but I wanted them to experience it. And I think you're right. I think that the society's not responding to that as much. The sheer opulence of the 3-star service. But do you think then, maybe in cuisine it's the same, do you think that we self-propagate the aristocracy of wine by maybe possibly turning our nose up at table side about what we're serving? Or is that easing a little bit in that the intimidation of wine, the barriers are breaking down a little bit with proper service?
I think the barriers are breaking down to a certain extent. I mean, it's up to those of us in the industry to break those barriers. I just think there's a huge divide in the wine consumption scene. And at the two opposite ends of the spectrum is, you go to any supermarket and it blows my mind how massive the wine section is. In every supermarket you go into, at least in Los Angeles, it's from one end of the store to the other.
That's true.
We're talking hundreds of selections, all in the, sub $30 price point. And the reason they have so much is because that amount of wine sells. And the customers who buy wine from a supermarket are always buying the same wines, or they might, from time to time, pick the one that's lateral to the price point and style. But for the most part, they're not exploring. They're not going to specialized wine shops. Then at the very opposite end of the spectrum, you have people who have been drinking and collecting fine wine for decades, and they're propagating that passion and that knowledge to the next generation. If you grew up in a household where your dad had a massive cellar of, vintage Bordeaux going back 30 years, and he gave you your first sip when you were 6 and taught you about left bank and right bank, it's almost inevitable that you're going to have some degree of passion for that. I think where the divide is in the middle of that. There is so many incredible wines in that $20 to $50 price point, which, mind you, I'm talking retail, but, in a restaurant would be, say, $60 to $100. And that is where so many people can be turned on to wine, where they discover something incredible that's better made than it ever has been in its past history, from any number of countries or grapes or styles. And then that becomes the hook to becoming not just a wine drinker, but somebody who cares about where their wine comes from, who picked it, why this goes with this particular meal. So I think that's where the opportunity is. And if we can really develop that wine drinking culture, then eventually people become intrigued by, well, why is this wine so expensive? Or what makes this particular vintage better than that one? And that's kind of where the intellectual pursuit needs to start. But you need to spark it. And in the people who buy wine from the supermarket, it hasn't been sparked at all. They like wine, but they almost see it as a grocery. It's the same emotional connection of gravitating towards the milk carton as it is the wine bottle.
I think that there's 1974. You had to have White Zinfandel, and White Zinfandel became the entry level, the entry for a lot of people into the wine trade, right? And I think that's a totally necessary part of our industry and what you see at the market. And I had the same experience every time I go to the market. My wife's like, why do you go to the wine section? I go, I want to see what's going on. And the last time I was at Ralph's, every single bottle had a shelf talker. I mean, how does anybody make a decision? I guess you can't blame the consumer for buying the same thing, because how do you make a decision when you've got your barrage by these yellow tags everywhere? But I think that section is important. And it's kind of where the section that the Wine of the Month Club is headed into. Because when we started this company in the 70s, it truly was unique in that we tasted everything that came into the door. And then we picked the best value, and that's still a really good service. The problem is on the internet, this stuff is just junk. And, we were starting to get into that fighting varietal price range, to use an old term, and competing with 12 bottles for $60 online. I mean, that's impossible. So we have to have this other level of upper level, not going to say upper crust, but upper intellectual wines. And it could be $20. You've tasted many great $20 wines that are properly made, right? They don't have to be doctored up with acid and sugar in order for them to be $20. But what drives me crazy about the online and the social side of wine is everybody saying, I'm going to simplify wine. Wine is not simple. You can't simplify it. It is complex for a reason, and it is intellectual, and that's why it's intellectual. And so our job really is to get the consumer to recognize that part and learn as much as they want to learn. They don't have to, they don't have to be like us who completely fall in love with the product and do everything we can to learn more, but they could certainly learn to understand the nuances of a wine, or to understand maybe the different parts of Napa as a different region. Rutherford's different than Oakville, whatever. Maybe not to learn anything at all, but to recognize that.
If they're curious, and that's the art, right? We have to, excellence in our industry is being able to transmit the passion without burdening them to any extent that they don't want to. And, you have to, I think this is where the skill of a sommelier, or even a server for that matter, but as you approach a table, you're being warm, you're being hospitable, but you're almost immediately reading the guest to decipher where do they want to take this conversation. And no two guests are the same. And some people don't want to get into the minutia of the wine at all. They just want to smell the wine, taste it, and say, you got it right. And that's great. And then there's others who say, tell me more. Why did you pick this? Or what am I going to eat with this? And so you have to be willing to go where the guest wants to go, because that's what's going to determine their experience. To our point of the 3 Michelin, I was in that exact same situation, where we were on the 10th course. And we basically said, we just want to leave. Like, can we, if you can skip courses 10 through 14.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That'd be wonderful. And my wife has a great photo of me yawning at the last one.
Oh, that's funny.
But that's a situation in which you are participating in the theater of the restaurant, as opposed to the service saying, what does this particular guest want to get out of this experience? And is going to pay an arm and a leg to get, and then not get it. So that's where that disconnect happens.
It's funny. I think you probably may have heard this on the podcast, but our best friends, all Napa, cellar was all full of Napa wines. This is years ago. We went to Clopagas, and finally my buddy looks at me. He goes, I think it's bullshit what you guys say. I go, what do you mean? He goes, the way you describe stuff. I said, okay. I said, let me ask you a question. I said, you got two Cabernets in front of you. They're both from different parts of this vineyard. They're both from the same winemaker at the same vintage. Are they different? Yes, they're different. Okay. Tell me why they're different. And of course, he didn't have the vernacular to tell me why they're different. He recognized that they're different. And that's like the beginning, right? That's like, okay, I understand now. And now they only really support the Bordeaux. So I feel very accomplished. It only took like 7 or 8 years, but they've now understood the nuances of Bordeaux, and they're starting to explore that. And I'm very proud of that. Not that I broke them out of just one style of wine, but that they recognize the difference. But how do you reconcile the complexity, of wine with the general public in this sense? Like, there's this whole movement on social. The wine industry needs innovation, and it angers me almost because I'm not sure what that means. And we went to Chateau Bailly, and I had a conversation with Veronique, and I found that innovation, that winery, what she's done there, and the way they've built this, and they can host events sitting on top of the concrete tanks. And it's a really cool place.
It's incredible.
And there's experiential innovation. I go, okay, that makes sense to me, that there's an experiential change. But is innovation to you something like putting wine in a can or putting it in a pouch? And, I had a woman in here not that long ago that thought she would set the world on fire because she put wine in a 375. I mean, for the listeners, even a 187, a split, a small bottle, that this was innovative. And what does innovation mean to you in this industry? What would you think would be innovative? An augmented reality label where there's some guy from Australia is telling you about the crime he had? I mean, is that an innovation? I'm just an intellectual question. I'm trying to figure this out.
I think certain things are hard to innovate upon. I think what makes wine magical and interesting is not something that you can market quickly or efficiently. And it's kind of like I'm a big fan of old sherry, and that's definitely that does not have a market at all. And, the sherry industry is one of the most historic forms of wine on the planet. And those who are initiated in that world know it's highly intellectual, maybe too intellectual, to the point where the wines just don't offer enough hedonism for, 98% of consumers. But that industry has suffered a lot, and because nobody's buying the wines. And there's been all sorts of attempts to make, say, cocktails using sherry and all these different things. And while I've always appreciated the initiative to save that industry, I think what makes the product so interesting is its authenticity, and it can't be for everyone. So you can come up with more creative packaging. You can put it in cocktails. You can maybe take a photograph of a celebrity drinking sherry. But I think ultimately some products just have a built-in exclusivity, either because of price or because of flavor profile or because of the fact that they're hard to come by. And if anything, you almost have to embrace that. You have to go off of the merits of that and market its uniqueness. And you'll still get a very small demographic of people who are interested in it, but you'll get the right people.
That's kind of interesting. It's sort of like my father drank gin, and he taught me to drink gin. He taught me how to make martinis when I was like 12 years old. And gin's not for everybody either, right? Yeah. So there's just inside the industries that we're talking about, distilled spirits or wine, there's probably things that people just may never come around to see. Do you think, like I think I mentioned in the opening, that I had tasted for the first time, which is really cool. A couple of cool experiences I had over the years. One is I got to taste, many times I've tasted a bottled wine and its canned counterpart. Exact same vintage, just different bottling line. And that's kind of interesting comparison, and they're different. And then tasting this alcoholic, a regular Pinot Noir from Santa Lucia, and then its non-alcoholic counterpart, right? And trying to see if there's any similarities. And as you know, the way they currently make non-alcoholic wine, you remove the 14% alcohol, but it also takes with it another 16 or 17% of whether the things that are in the wine, and then they backfill it. So it's actually very expensive to do.
Yeah,
because you lose 30% of your crop basically before you add back water and flavoring agents to make it palatable, which they're not in general. Is there a calling for non-alcoholic wines? And do you think this is a phase, much like some of these packaging options?
I was talking about this just yesterday with a colleague. I'm very curious to see if the non-alcoholic sector, I think it'll be around for some time, but I wonder what its incarnation will be 20, 30 years from now. A few things could happen. The medium could evolve to something interesting, but not wine. I think, the properties that make wine interesting are lost once you have to go through a process as rigorous as reverse osmosis to remove alcohol. I think non-alcoholic category can be really interesting once people incorporate like a botanical element. Once you're trying to capture flavor profiles that are not sweet, right? Because like so many people have said, if you're going to drink a non-alcoholic wine, why not just get a soda and it's going to taste better? And I agree with that. I enjoy a good Diet Coke from time to time, so there's nothing wrong with that. But I think people who order non-alcoholic wine are looking to participate in the ritual of interesting, complex flavor profiles that are not something that you would necessarily have at home. And so I think if that industry embraces things like herbaceousness, bitter flavors, almost like a gin or Amaro sort of approach, you could come up with some really interesting things. You just have to think of it as separate from wine.
That's an interesting thought. I did not look at it that way. When we were at the Fancy Food Show a couple of years ago in Vegas, it's a great show. If you've not been to the Fancy Food Show, we used to go every year. My wife and I it was in San Francisco. It used to be 4 buildings with just like, you get a piece of Iberian ham, and then you get a jelly bean, and then you get, yogurt, and then you get cheese. There's no order. And so then you go to the Pepto-Bismol booth.
Jelly beans and cheese are a natural combination.
Yeah, exactly. They had jelly beans flavored like Tabasco. Anyway, the last time we went, which 2 years ago, the overriding thing was non-alcoholic everything. A guy stopped me with a Prosecco. It was very good, actually, for considering. But there are a lot of non-alcoholic distilled spirits. I didn't think of it that way because I thought, why would I drink this instead of a bourbon? Because they don't taste anything like. But I think you're right. I think it's more of an experience of a series of palatable flavors and probably the main senses, like you said, bittersweet, whatever you're talking about. That's a really interesting thought. But it's funny you said that because my wife and I were on the Scarsdale diet, which you're probably too young to even know what it is, but that was a famous diet in the 80s. And the Scarsdale cocktail was soda water on ice with a lime twist. It looked like you were having a gin and tonic. And no one knew the difference. So just drink that. Why do you have to drink something that's faking, what it is?
Yeah, and that's the problem. We're talking about story. Wine is story. So non-alcoholic wine doesn't have a story. It's a product. It's made for a certain demographic. People who are trying to cut back or people who don't drink, and that's totally commendable and necessary. But if you're going to have a story, sometimes you drink something like Barolo Canato, or I mentioned Amaro earlier, and you find out that all the plants and herbs and botanicals that go into it are from the local area. That's an automatic terroir reference, specialized, unique. There's a story to tell there. Now there's a huge trend for every type of gin imaginable using only indigenous plants from wherever it came from, whether that's Australia or Spain or anywhere. And I think if you try to market that and say, this is made in this one part of the world and it doesn't have alcohol and it doesn't even have to be grape based. It could be anything based. But it has these ingredients that you can't get anywhere else. That's something unique. That's an experience. And that's what people are trying to have in the dining atmosphere. So I think we're maybe a decade or two away from really developing that category into something interesting. But there is a need for people who don't want to drink alcohol. So I think it'll get there eventually.
But, I don't think people in the industry know this. I mean, non-alcoholic wines have been around a long time. And the oldest one I know of is called Ariel. And I think it was bought by or was made by one of the big Rodney Strong, and I when this thing started, I called them. I said, I used to stock this on my dad's shelf in the 80s, in our shop. I go, how has it gone for you? He goes, it's still a very, very, very small percentage of our sales, and it really hasn't grown that much. And I thought, well, that's interesting because there's been such a public awareness to non-alcoholic wines, and most of them are really, really bad. I mean, they're just like there's no point in drinking them. Yeah. But I think this idea you're talking about is kind of a unique approach, and it may extend the life of it.
The 82 vintage of that is delicious, by the way.
Which one?
The Rodney Strong non-alcoholic.
Oh, yeah.
It's peaking right now.
Thanks myself. You said that with a straight face. I'm like, wow. Ariel is called Ariel, but it's been around. We're almost at that time, which is unbelievable. But I did want to address one thing. Since you and I are both Armenian heritage, and this is a burgeoning marketplace for them, they've learned to make some wines. We saw each other at Guinea Fest, and there seems to be a few things now. The wine industry in Armenia was stalled basically for 75 years or 72 years by the USSR, and now we've got some traction with understanding techniques, and I'm producing something I think you'll find really interesting on the idea. But the headwinds to a retailer like yourself to bring into the fold a district which is ancient. I kind of argue with New World because we're putting out things that have that New World character, but Old World because it's been around for so damn long, right? But stalled. But how do you see any burgeoning area? Let's say it's Croatia. We haven't seen Croatian wines in America. I don't think I've tasted two, but they make great wines. Mm-hmm. And let's say they want to bring them to the U.S., as the Armenians are trying to do. And what the Armenian problem is I extend this comment here, that I'm hearing from the vendors that day that we met was too many wines, not enough buyers. When somebody walks into your shop and says, "Hey, I got this wine from Vajazdor, Arani," what's your general response to them?
Well, usually they know because of my last name that I'm Armenian.
Yeah. And they think, Akber, you're gonna bring it in.
There's no shortage of those knocks on the door. It's true. Even at Wally's, at each location, we have 3,000 different SKUs. And
wow,
what happens is you're constantly on the lookout for great wine from anywhere. It doesn't matter, if it's Armenia or if it's Chile or if it's, Canada's now making better and better dry wines. Like the wine world is constantly evolving. And as tastemakers, we have to be on the lookout for what's great. And so the first criteria has to be a great wine. Armenia has made leaps and bounds in the last decade, but it's still infantile in its evolution, kind of like what we were talking about with the non-alcoholic scene. There is going to eventually emerge that one wine from the country that becomes what, Vega Sicilia's Unico is for Spain, or what Monfertino Barolo might be for Italy, or, there's all sorts of examples we can think of, but it's that one wine that kind of stands out and leads the charge on quality. Because there's not a lot of experience, we're still identifying the terroirs, the soil types. But the great thing is that there's so much interest now because like we said, wine is story and wine is history. And now we've discovered that this is one of the most interesting historic and ancient lands in the world. And the fact that we still have this genetic material for all these ancient grapes, the Areni grape in Jancis Robinson's book, its lineage is basically unknown because of how ancient it is. And how cool is that? Like Pinot Noir gets the whole fold out page and the chart and everything and related to 200 other grapes, but Areni's ancient. And there are other ancient grapes, other whites and reds. And as they realize how to vinify those, how to grow them, what the different provinces mean for the quality of the wine, I think we're going to have something really interesting emerge. It's just going to take time. Everything in wine is slow, as we know.
Well, that's it. It's the slowest industry in the world. You get one chance a year, to figure it out. And you probably know Mariam Sagatelian. She started when she comes to LA, we're going to have dinner because she's a very intellectual, bright young woman, and she gentrified a whole street in Yerevan because she opened the first wine bar ever called Invino. She was on my show recently, and she said something very interesting. She goes, "We really don't know what Arani tastes like," and we discussed this off camera. I think in the general knowledge of winemaking, and if you're a Frenchman and you go to Armenia and you help, or an Italian, you bring oak and you bring, they use Artsakh oak instead of French oak, whatever, and they start doing the things that are typical of a region to see what's going to happen. And like you and I kind of agreed, I don't think Arani likes oak, and they're finally figuring that out. And it's taken how many generations and how many different vintages to do that. And of course, all of the complexities of a terroir and the different regions are important. But her comment saying, we really don't know what it is. And I've had a couple of purer ones. Senator, my wife's cousin, the Tfankian hotel chain, has created a biodynamic Arani from the Arani district. And it's, you start to understand the grape a little bit because there's nothing played with, right?
There is too much variance.
Yeah.
I find that in certain wine regions, like in Priorat as well, there isn't a unified style. And there's so many different things you can do with the grapes and the terroir. And to your point, you line up 10 Arenis and they're all different.
Yeah, they're all different. And then Vi Kashkarian on the marketing side said in the recent conversation that Armenia is still in the push phase of marketing. The pull hasn't happened yet, and people aren't going into the stores in the restaurants saying, "Hey, why don't you have an Armenian wine?" And I said this in a little speech I gave the other day at the Armenian Assembly event, which was basically what you said. We're in its infancy. People don't know who we are. It takes a long time. It's very slow. But if you did walk into Wally's and said, hey, I've heard, I'm talking to my server and I go, hey, I heard there's some great Armenian wines. Do you have any? And if there were enough of those conversations occurring at the table side or bar side, that maybe it would not wake up, but it would alert to buyers to that.
Well, there's two things. You have to have the wine available. It has to be of really high quality so that even if you don't recommend it, if somebody just grabs it off the shelf, pays for it and walks out the door, whenever they do open that bottle, it has to be great because they're going to remember they got it from Wally's.
Yeah.
The other thing is making it accessible, right? Relying on somebody to walk through the door and ask for an Armenian wine is almost never going to happen.
Yeah, right.
But we offer an already by the glass from Kadas at both locations in LA, Santa Monica and Beverly Hills. And the sheer amount of people who have opened up the by the glass list and said, oh, interesting, I want to try this red wine from Armenia. And it's very affordably priced, so there's no risk.
Yeah, right.
And you taste it and you go, wow, that's delicious. So it's that much more imperative that the wine you position there be of high quality, that it be good value, because that's going to be the gateway.
It's the Kadas brand you put there?
Yeah, it's the single vineyard already.
Oh, it's odd. I'm going to interrupt this thing. We're going to wrap this up. It's been 50 minutes, but I have fun with this. And since you're in Bordeaux all the time and in France and you're buying a lot of French wines, this is a book written by a French doctor. It was 1970 something. And wine is the best medicine. Actually, you can listen to him online too. He's got some videos out there. Pretty interesting stuff. It's all in French mostly. But this book is a book full of human maladies, bronchitis, diarrhea, fever, gout, and the equivalent wine to fix that. Okay? And so
Armenian wine fixes all of those, but
yeah, you all know that. Unfortunately, since it's French, Adeni's not on here, Sangivesi's not here, but I'm going to give you a malady, and I'll give you 3 French wines, and it's kind of like the Master of Wine test or Master of Somm test, where, yeah, the answer could be wrong, which usually everybody gets it wrong, but it's the reason, the logic behind why you chose that answer, right?
Yeah, I see. Like justification.
Yes. And so we're going to go with bronchitis. So if you had bronchitis in France, would you have a Medoc, a dry champagne, or a Burgundy to help your bronchitis? And there's a dosage to this, by the way. What do you think?
I was thinking Sauterne to coat the esophagus.
There you go. So you've already had an answer with a reason.
I don't know how much research you did, but I'm just going to go and contradict all of them.
Yes.
Write my own book.
So this is, it's a Burgundy.
Bold,
warm.
I love old wine books. They're so great.
But he wants you to warm it to 140 degrees.
Even Richebourg?
He doesn't give a vineyard designation here. Because both of these wines are rich in phosphorus. The properties of which is listed at the beginning of this book. Dosage. Heat the chosen wine in a double boiler to 140 degrees, which is, pretty warm. Add 10 grams of cinnamon sugar and lemon peel. Drink 3 coffee cupfuls a day.
Was this book approved by the FDA?
No, it doesn't say that in the back. It was approved by the French. Actually, there's some funny ones here. Like there's a fever, dry champagne, and the dosage is a whole bottle.
I like that one. I'm going to use that tip.
It's pretty funny. The funny thing is, when I give it to French winemakers, everybody gets it wrong, and then it's always for a laugh. But we're at 53 minutes. Been a pleasure, and we could probably talk forever. But I think when Mariam comes into the town, she was supposed to be here for an event. She didn't make it. The event was canceled. We will get to Wally's, or we will meet somewhere in Pasadena and share some stories, because she's a flag waver and sort of she took a huge risk, and now she's opened her second tasting room, and she hosts these events much like Wally's, and dinners and cheese pairings and things, and she's really intriguing to chat with.
I would love to. I'm way overdue for a trip to Armenia. I've been 4 times, but I haven't been in over a decade now as my last trip. And from my family who has gone, the sheer transformation of wine culture, including the wine bars and that street, I've heard all the stories, and I can't wait to see it.
It's pretty inspiring. Unfortunately, it's still Armenia, 100 meters out of town, in all directions. It's still old USSR sort of ambiance, but I guess it has to start somewhere in the center of Yerevan. Very safe, open till 4 a.m, very European, and you feel like you can walk, anywhere you want.
And the last time I was there, I did go into the RNE1 cave where they found the 6,000-year-old evidence of winemaking, and it's surreal. Like, especially as an Armenian, it just like puts you into connection with this ancient history.
Really crazy.
Yeah. It's been great because my journey into wine has pretty much been parallel with the same time that Armenia's journey has been. And so, over these past 12 years or so, to see the Armenian interest in wine it's been inspiring for sure.
I stopped. I will tell you this story before we get off because it's really funny. And we were shooting this thing, and we are way down Adani near the cave. I was in an experimental vineyard where they're propagating some of these other Armenian varieties that are there's like 400, and seeing how the wine is being evolved. And so we're stopping by, and the director of the show goes, "Hey, why don't we stop at one of these roadside vendors and buy some wine?" And I'm like, "Hey," and I'm like, "Okay, that'll be fun." The first guy we stopped at, because they're there and they make their own wine, and they make vodka and they make all this other stuff, and they have grapes piled up, whatever you want to buy, pickled vegetables. The first guy was like, you can't film me. I don't know what this guy in this roadside in Adani village of Armenia cares about being filmed, but you're not filming me. So I went to the next one as a woman, and I had a blast with her, even she spoke no English. So I could be very sarcastic and dry with her. And then the director goes, "You got to taste it." I go, "Man, come on, man." I go, "Yeah, taste this." It's a 2-liter bottle of Coca-Cola filled with this inky red wine. And you know what? I tasted it, and I wouldn't sit and have a glass of it, but it was certainly palatable.
Palatable's good for roadside.
Yeah, it was certainly palatable. And the funny part was, it was a 2-liter bottle. I wasn't going to lug that back into my hotel room, but I was going to buy some. So I said, "Do you have a smaller bottle?" She goes, "Yeah, I have a smaller bottle." She goes in the back of her little shed, comes back with an empty bottle of Coca-Cola and puts a funnel in it and pours the next one.
Just became a half bottle.
It became a half bottle. We thought that was hilarious. She put the cap on. And I walked into the hotel room. My wife's like, "What is that?" I go, "Well," and my buddy said, "It's because it's so close to the border that I think Iran, right? The Iranian border is near there, that they can drive into Armenia and buy alcohol."
Oh, is that why?
Yeah, that's what he thinks the reason is. And it's in a Coke bottle. And so it looks like wine. It looks like Coke. So anyway, great having you here. Thanks for taking the time on a Friday morning.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Paul.
I hope we do it again. We'll come see you. I'm sure I'll be in Wally soon for some other event that's possibly coming up for Noreen or something.
Good. You got a glass of RNE waiting.
Okay, cool. Cheers.
Thanks, Paul.
Take care.